Hi everyone. So today we will start the unit 1, that is plant water relations, and here you will come to know about the diffusion and the imbibition in today's session. Let's begin. So we know that the diffusion, it is a process of a movement of a molecules from region of the higher concentration to the region of the lower concentration is known as the diffusion. So what is diffusion? It is the movement of the molecules from the higher concentration to the lower concentration. Okay, so it is the tendency of the molecules to spread out in order to occupy the available space. And here the gaseous and the molecules in a liquid have tendency to diffuse from more concentrated environment to the less concentrated environment. Okay, so the gaseous and the molecules in the liquid have tendency to diffuse from higher concentration to the lower concentration. So this diffusion, it is a type of a passive transport. So we know that there are two types of transport system in the plant. They are active transport as well as the passive transport. Okay. So the active and passive transport are the two main biological process which plays an important role in supplying the nutrients, water, oxygen and other essential molecules to the cell, and also by removing the waste products. Both the active and passive transport works for the same cause. So these both active and passive, they work for the same cause but with the different moment. Okay, so what happens in active transport? Active transport requires the chemical energy because it is the movement of a biochemicals from the areas of lower concentration to the areas of higher concentration. So here in active transport, the movement of the molecules is from the lower concentration to the higher concentration. But in passive transport, the molecules move from the areas of higher concentration to the lower concentration. So it does not require the energy here. Okay, so in active transport, there is a chemical energy requirement. In passive, there is no energy requirement. So what is active now? Active means it is the movement of the molecules from the lower concentration to the higher concentration. And passive means movement of the molecules from the higher concentration to the lower concentration. Okay, so this diffusion, it is a passive transport system. Okay, so there is no energy required here. We know that in higher green plants, some substance enter the living cell through the aerial parts. So the aerial parts are nothing but the leaves, and the diffusion of the carbon dioxide and the oxygen which are present in the atmosphere, these enter into the plants with the help of the stomata. So from the soil, water and ions of the simple inorganic salts pass into the plant through the roots. By this process is nothing but the diffusion only. And similarly, the loss of large quantities of water as a vapor from the leaves and the other aerial organs into the atmosphere is also accompanied by the diffusion. Here, the oxygen evolved in the photosynthesis and the respiratory CO2 also diffuse out of the plant into the atmosphere. And in the plants, the movement of the substance within the plant. So what is this movement of the substance within the plant? It means the movement of the substance from one part of the plant to the another part of the plant is mainly by the diffusion. The gas molecules move through the intercellular spaces and the water and solutes through the dead and living vessels and also from the cell to cell with the help of the diffusion. So we can say that the process of photosynthesis that occurs in the plant leaves depends upon the diffusion of gases. Okay, so in photosynthesis, the energy from the sunlight, water and carbon dioxides are used to produce glucose, oxygen and water. The carbon dioxide diffuses from the air through the tiny pores known as the stomata, and oxygen which are produced by the photosynthesis, they also diffuse from the plant through the stomata into the atmosphere. Okay, so now we can say that diffusion is the movement of a substance from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Or the diffusion happens in liquids and gases because their particles move randomly from one place to the another place. And also we can define the diffusion as the diffusion is an important process for living things. Okay, so it is how the substance move in and out of the cells. Next, if we talk about the types of the diffusion in plants, so there are two types. They are simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. So in simple diffusion, the movement of the molecules along their concentration gradient without the direct involvement of any other molecule. So what is this concentration gradient now? It is the difference in the concentration of the substance between the two areas is known as the concentration gradient. And what does the simple diffusion says? The movement of the molecule along their concentration gradient without the direct involvement of any other molecule. Okay, so it can involve either the spreading of the material through the medium or the transport of the particle across the membrane. So this is the image that shows the simple representation of the diffusion of one particle in the another medium. Second one, that is the facilitated diffusion. So what does this facilitated diffusion mean? So here we have taken the plasma membrane. The large molecules such as the glucose, they cannot freely diffuse across the cell membrane. So these molecules must move down their concentration gradient with the help of the transport proteins. Okay, so the glucose molecules must move down their concentration gradient with the help of the transport proteins. So what I said the concentration gradient mean? The difference in the concentration of the substance between the two areas is known as the concentration gradient. And this glucose molecule must move its concentration gradient with the help of the transport protein, that is the carrier proteins. So what does this carrier protein do? So the carrier proteins can change their shape. So the carrier proteins, they can change their shape to move the target molecules. The target molecules are the glucose molecule. Okay, so these carrier proteins, they change their shape to move the target molecules from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane. So what does this facilitated diffusion mean now? So the facilitated diffusion means the protein canals embedded in the cell membrane have the opening to the outside of the cell that allow the certain molecules to fit inside, and only the molecules with the certain characters such as the shape and size are allowed for the passage from one side, that is the outside of the cell, to the intercellular space. Okay, so since this process does not require any energy, that is known as the facilitated diffusion and is considered as the passive transport. Okay, so understood the facilitated diffusion. As the term facilitated only indicates, it requires the presence of the another molecule, that is the facilitator. It is nothing but carrier protein. So as the term indicates, that is facilitating means what? The facilitator must be present in there. Okay, so it requires the presence of another molecule, that is the facilitator is nothing but the transport protein, in order for the diffusion to occur. And this facilitated diffusion is necessary for the movement of large molecules or the polar molecules like glucose across the hydrophobic bilipid layer. Hydrophobic bilipid layer means it is the plasma membrane. Okay, so the plasma membrane is having the hydrophilic head as well as the hydrophobic tail. So this is the head and this is the tail portion. So the hydrophilic head means, so this head with it will dissolve in the water, and the tail, that is the hydrophobic, they will not dissolve in the water, and hence the hydrophobic bilipid layer must require the carrier protein to dissolve the molecules. Understood the facilitated diffusion? So in types of diffusion of plants, you studied simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. These are the two types of diffusion which occur in the plant. Let's move to the next slide. Here you can see it is an example of the diffusion. So here a lump of a sugar is dropped into a beaker of water, and then the sugar molecules will break off from the lump. Next what happens? They move from the higher concentration to the lower concentration, and eventually what happens, all the sugar molecules become distributed throughout the water. So this is an example of the diffusion. Seeing to the factors affecting rate of diffusion in plants, there are many factors which affects the diffusion, like temperature, size of the particles, thickness of the barrier, concentration gradient, total surface area of the cell, and also the diffusion pressure gradient, density and pressure also affects the diffusion. So at temperature, what happens, the rate of diffusion here, it is directly proportional to increase in the temperature. Okay, then I said the diffusion pressure gradient. So before diffusion pressure gradient, we have to understand the concept of the pressure gradient. So what is this pressure gradient? It is the rate of change of the atmospheric pressure. Okay, so the pressure gradient means it is the rate of change of atmospheric pressure. It is a force that acts the direction from higher to lower pressure. Okay, so it is a force that acts in the direction from higher to the lower pressure, that is known as the pressure gradient. And diffusion pressure gradient means the difference in the diffusion pressure determines the rate of diffusion. That the rate of diffusion is directly proportional to the difference in the concentration of the molecules in two regions, that is known as the diffusion pressure gradient. Also I said about the density. Here the rate of diffusion is inversely proportional to the square root of density of the gases. Also, the pressure plays an important role in the diffusion of gases. As a gas diffuse from region of the higher partial pressure to the region of the lower partial pressure. So what does this partial pressure mean? So we can take an example. If a container is filled with more than one gas, each gas exerts the pressure. Okay, so the pressure of any one gas in the container is known as the partial pressure. Okay, so these are the factors which affects the rate of diffusion in plants. They are nothing but the temperature, size of the particle, thickness of the barriers, concentration gradients, total surface area of the cell membrane, and diffusion of a pressure gradient, density and the pressures. Next, if we see the importance of the diffusion, so there are many importance of the diffusion, like the diffusion helps in the exchange of the gases through the stomata that takes place by the process of the diffusion only, and it also helps in transpiration which occurs by the principle of the diffusion, and the ions are absorbed by the simple diffusion in plants. The food material is translocated by the diffusion process. This process keeps the walls of internal tissue of the plant moist. Okay, so it is responsible for spreading the ions and the molecules throughout the protoplast. Also helps in aroma of the flowers is also due to the diffusion of the aromatic compounds to attract the insects. So these are some of the importance of the diffusion. So this was all about the diffusion. In diffusion, you came to know about the diffusion, that is the definition of the diffusion and types of the diffusion, factors which affects the rate of diffusion and the importance of the diffusion. Moving towards the next topic, that is imbibition. So what is imbibition mean? The absorption of water by the solid particles of an absorbent without forming a solution is called as imbibition. So what is imbibition? Imbibition, it is the process of absorption of water by the substance without forming a solution, that is known as the imbibition. In other words, the absorption of water by the hydrophilic colloids is known as the imbibition. So what are these colloids? Where the water is absorbed by the solid particles. The solid particles are nothing but the colloids. So these cause an enormous increase in the volume of the imbibition. And the colloids are insoluble particles of one substance, or they are suspended in another substance also. The size of the suspended particles in the colloid can range from 1 to 1000 nanometers. And if we talk about the example of the imbibition, the swelling of the seeds when immersed in the water is an example of the imbibition. Also, the cotton fibers absorb the water by this process. And the dry plant material or the seeds act as the absorbent to imbibe the water and swell. The swollen seeds produce the large pressure which are developed by the imbibition. These are the examples of the imbibition. So the substance that imbibes the water is known as imbibient. Okay, so the substance that imbibes the water is called as imbibient, and the liquid which imbibed is known as the absorbent. The liquid which is imbibed is known as the absorbent. The process of imbibition occurs mainly due to the presence of hydrophilic colloids. So what are hydrophilic? Hydrophilic means water loving or they radially absorbing the moisture, and the colloids means they are the solid particles. The water is absorbed by the solid particles, they are nothing but the colloids. So the imbibition occurs mainly due to the presence of hydrophilic colloids. Next, the role of imbibition in plants or the imbibition in plants. Why does the imbibition occurs in the plants? Okay, so the imbibition is the first step in absorption of the water by the roots and the cells, and the imbibition of the water by the cell walls helps to keep the cells moist. Also, the imbibition pressure is helpful in the seed germination, growth of the seedlings through the soil, ascent of the sap in plants. So why does the imbibition occurs in plants? To help in the absorption of the water by the roots and the cells, to keep the cells moist, and it helps in the seed germination, growth of the seedlings through the soil, and also it helps in the ascent of sap in plants. And conditions necessary for the imbibition, there are two conditions mainly. The water potential gradient should occur between the imbibient and the liquid imbibe. What is this water potential? Water potential is nothing but the potential energy of an water. So the potential energy of an water should occur between the absorbent and the liquid imbibed. And the second one, there should be an force of attraction between the imbibient and the imbibed liquid. So the second one says that there must be affinity or the force of attraction between the absorbent and the imbibed liquid. Also one condition is there, that is the temperature. So increase in the temperature also brings about then increased imbibition in the plants. So this was about the conditions. Next, if we see the characters of the imbibition, there are 5 characters, that is absorption, water potential gradient, heat of wetting, increase in volume. First one, that is adsorption. Adsorption means what? So we all know that the substance which absorbs the water are known as the imbibients. Okay, and the imbibients holds the water by the adsorption due to a great force of attraction between the two molecule is known as the adsorption. Okay, so the imbibients holds the water due to the great force of attraction between the two molecule. That term is known as the adsorption. Second one, that is water potential. Water potential means, as I said, the potential energy of an water. Okay, so the imbibients have very high negative water potential, that is also known as the matrix potential. Here water has the maximum water potential, and that's why it is the character of the imbibition. And then third one, water potential gradient. So what is this? When a dry imbibient with high negative water potential which comes in contact with the water means it is a maximum water potential. Okay, so when a dry imbibient which is having the high negative water potential which comes in contact with the maximum water potential, here a slope of a water potential is created and water diffuses rapidly from its higher potential into the imbibient is termed as the water potential gradient. Fourth one, that is the heat of wetting, means the energy in the form of heat is released during the imbibition, that is known as the heat of wetting. Fifth one, increase in the volume, means a volume of an imbibient increases during the imbibition. Example, we can say swelling of a soaked seeds or swelling of a wooden frames during the rainy season. So that is the increase in the volume. So there is another terminology in the imbibition, that is the imbibition pressure. So what is this imbibition pressure? When the imbibing substance is kept in confined place. The imbibing substance means what? The substance which are absorbing the water, when they are kept in the confined space, a pressure is developed due to the increase in the volume of the imbibient. That pressure is known as the imbibition pressure. So what is imbibition pressure? When the imbibing substance is kept in a confined space, the pressure is developed due to the increase in the volume of the imbibient. This is known as the imbibition pressure. Next, seeing to the factors affecting the imbibition. So there are many factors like nature of an imbibient, temperature, concentration of the solute, then surface area of an imbibient. Why I said nature of an imbibient? We know that different type of organic substance have different imbibing capacities. Like proteins have very high imbibing capacity, starch has less capacity of imbibing, and the cellulose is the weakest imbiber. That's why we can see the proteinaceous seeds swell more on imbibition than the starch seeds. So the nature of an imbibient affects the imbibition process. Then temperature, it is another factor which affects the imbibition. Here the rate of imbibition increases with the increase in temperature. So the rate of imbibition increases with the increase in the temperature. Then concentration means the increase in the concentration of a solute decreases the imbibition process. Okay, so if there is an increase in the concentration of the solute, it decreases the imbibition process. Then last one, the surface area of an imbibient is another factor which affects the imbibition. So what is the surface area? So the imbibition will be greater when the surface area of an imbibient is larger. Okay, so the imbibition process will be greater when the surface area of an imbibient is larger. So these are few of the factors which affects the imbibition. Next, importance of the imbibition. So we know that imbibition is dominant in the initial stage of a water absorption by the roots. Then the seed germination is initiated by the imbibition, and imbibition force is useful in adhering the water to the walls of the xylem elements. So it helps the xylem elements to carry the water molecules. Then the fruits retain water by imbibition. The fruits retain water by the imbibition process. Then the movement of the water into the ovules that are ripening into the seeds is made possible by the process of the imbibition. So the ovules which are ripening into the seeds, they get water with the help of the imbibition process. So this was all about the diffusion and the imbibition. I hope you guys understood well. Thank you.